In this video, I'm going to show you how to build a bicycle from the ground up. This is something that's usually taken on by someone with more advanced mechanical skills, and it's something that you need to either have access to or own a few specific tools, particularly headset tools. The reason that you would want to build a bike from the ground up is if you want to pick out every component. If you're like me, you're probably pretty specific on the type of components you want, or if you're changing out a frame and you want to keep your other components. When I'm going through this, I'm not going to go into very detailed instructions of how to do specific things like bleed brakes or cut the steerer tube on a fork. I'll show the basics, but for those I'll probably make a few separate videos to go into more detail so that this video isn't too long. The bike that I'm going to be building is a Giant Anthem 27.5 mountain bike. And I've got it here in the box, and the first thing that you're going to want to do is actually install the seat post so you can put it in your work stand. So I've just opened the box and I've got the seat tube accessible, so I'm just going to slip in my seat post, and obviously you don't need to worry about this being straight or anything. The idea is just to be able to get it in there so you can clamp it in your work stand, and you don't need to do that very tight. Alright, I've got it in the work stand. And the first thing that I do, this is optional, but I always use frame saver tape. I get this stuff at the Colorado Cyclist. It's kind of pricey. I mean, it's 10 bucks or so for a roll of it, but it really does a good job in protecting the frame. And what I'm going to do is go in and put the frame saver tape under the down tube, put it in places where my heel can contact the frame, and I put it on my cranks. So again, this is optional, but it's a step I like to do before I start the actual build process. Okay, the next step is to press in your head cups and your bottom bracket. Now this bike actually came with the head cups already installed, so I don't need to do that, but I do need to press the bottom bracket. And I'm going to need a head cup press or bearing press like this Park HHP2. And this is obviously one of the specific tools that a lot of people are not going to have in your garage. So what you can do is take your frame and fork and bottom bracket to the shop and have them install the fork and the bottom bracket. Then you're going to have most of the tools that you need if you have a decent workshop at home. You will need some cable cutters, but most of it really is Allen wrenches and a few other things. Now this is a press fit bottom bracket. Most bikes are going to be press fit or threaded. If you have a threaded bottom bracket, then you'll need a tool to do that. And this would be the tool that you would need if your bottom bracket was threaded. Okay, I've added a little bit of grease inside the surface of the bottom bracket shell where the bearings are going to go. And always do one side at a time. So I'm going to press in the non-drive side first. Okay, I've got the non-drive side bearing pressed in. Now I'm going to do the drive side. And one thing that you need to pay attention to is the width of the bottom bracket shell. This shell is an 89.5, and the instructions that came with the bottom bracket say that I need one spacer on the drive side for an 89.5 width bottom bracket shell. If it were a 92, then I would not need a spacer. So I'm going to go ahead and press this in. Alright, now that I've got the bottom bracket in, I'm going to go ahead and put the cranks on. So this is your typical two-piece crank. Just going to slide it through and bolt on the other side. These are, Shimano's different. This is a race face, so Shimano actually has the spindle on the drive side crank arm. This one has it on the non-drive side. So I'm just going to put this on. And this one uses an 8mm Allen wrench to thread the crank arm on. Now this one already had grease on the spindle when it came out of the box, which a lot of them do when they're new. But make sure you put some grease, some waterproof grease on the spindle before you put the crank arm on. Okay, I've got the cranks on. And let me say that on some bikes, depending on how difficult the cable routing is, you may want to hold off on putting on the cranks until after you run your cables, and you've got to put your fork on obviously before you do that. This bike, it doesn't really matter. The cable routing is pretty easy to get to. So now that I've got the cranks on, I'm going to go ahead and put the pedals on. And always put a little dab of grease inside and or on the pedal threads themselves. When you put pedals on, the right pedal is a normal thread and the left pedal is a reverse thread. So keep that in mind. And this crank requires a washer that came with it, so I did put the washer on, and I'm going to put the pedals on. And like most Shimano pedals, you use an 8mm Allen wrench on the other side to tighten it down. Pedals do not have to be that tight. This is one of the most over-tightened components I see on a bicycle. They really don't need to be all that tight. Now I'm going to go ahead and put the saddle on. Once you have the seat post on, which obviously you do in the beginning, it doesn't matter if you do this at the beginning or at the end of building the bike. But when you do, always put some grease on the rails. The only reason you would not want to do this if you have carbon rails, then you need to use a carbon specific grease. So I'm going to grease up the rails and then put on the seat, put on the saddle. As you're putting on things like saddles and stems and handlebars, don't try to line it up. You're going to do that once the bike is on the ground. And that's one of the last things that you do, is just to straighten up your bars and saddle and all that. Now I'm going to put the rear derailleur on. This is something that you can do before or after you install the fork, so it doesn't really matter, but I'm going to go ahead and do it now. So I'm just going to put, I put some grease on the threads of the derailleur. And you've seen me put grease on threads, and I recommend putting just a little bit of grease on any thread unless it goes into carbon. If it's aluminum to aluminum, put some grease on the threads. So I take a 5mm Allen wrench, which is what most derailleurs are, and go ahead and tighten down the derailleur. This is another component that does not have to be all that tight. Now at this point you would also want to install your front derailleur. This bike I'm actually going to run as a 1x10, so I'm not going to put on a front derailleur. But if you were going to put on a front derailleur, you probably want to go ahead and do it when you do the rear derailleur. Again, before or after you install the fork, it doesn't matter. Okay, the next step is to install the fork. And I'm not going to go into detail into this. I am going to post up another video on my YouTube channel that's going to show how to do this in more detail. But I'll just cover the real basic steps. Okay, what I've done is I've actually installed the fork on the bike with the steerer tube. And I've got all my spacers on, headset, stem. I'm going to mark on the steerer tube where I want to cut. And again, I'm going to do this in more detail in another video. Okay, now I've got the fork installed on the bike with the steerer tube cut. I put the bearings in, put the spacers on, put the stem on, and now it's time to install the handlebars. Alright, got the handlebar on the bike, and now I'm going to put the shifters and brakes on. This bike I'm only running as a 1x, so I put the right shifter on. And then I'm going to put the brakes on, and then just tighten everything just a little bit, just enough so they don't move around, because obviously you're going to make all your final adjustments once the wheels are on the bike and the bike's on the ground. Okay, on this bike, I've got the handlebar and the shifter on, and I'm going to start with the rear brake on this one. So I've just loosely installed the caliper. I'm going to put the housing inside the bike because that's the way this bike is designed to run. Or you could also go on the outside with the brake. So I will have to cut the brake line, reinstall it, and then bleed the brakes. And again, for that process, I'm going to do as a separate video. Okay, so I've got the rear brake caliper installed. I've got it run through the frame. I've cut the housing, I've bled the brake. And before I do the front, I went ahead and cut the derailleur housing. And when you do this, I didn't show it on the video, actually cutting it, but when you measure it, make sure that you twist the handlebars with kind of your measurement in place before you actually do the cut. And you want to make sure the handlebars can twist around without the cable being too tight. Okay, so now that I've got the cable cut, I'm going to run the inner wire through the housing and hook up the rear derailleur. Okay, now it's time to feed the inner wire through the housing. Before I do, I've got some grease on my fingers, and I'm just going to put some grease on the cable before I run it through the housing. And I'll just feed it through. It's going to come out the back, and I'll hook up the rear derailleur to the cable. Now I won't be adjusting the rear derailleur obviously until I get the wheels on, and then it'll be time to adjust the derailleurs. Okay, got the cable into the rear derailleur. I'm just going to tighten it down. Make sure it's in there good. Now it's time to just cut the cable and then put the end cap on the cable. Now I'm going to get the wheels ready to put on the bike. These are brand new wheels, so I've got to put on the tire, the rotor, and for the rear wheel, the cassette. Alright, I've got the wheels on, and before I put the chain on, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to line up the brakes. So you keep these calipers loose if you have never lined them up before. And then what you do, typically most of these take a 5mm Allen wrench. You can squeeze the lever, and while you're squeezing the lever, tighten down the two bolts. Sometimes that works, sometimes it does not. If it does not work, then you've got to just line up the rotor between the pads as you hold the caliper and kind of move it back and forth and tighten it up. So do that for the front and the rear. Before you put the chain on, you want to kind of eyeball your set screws and move the derailleur. Just by looking at your pulley wheels and lining them up with the cassette as best you can. Then you'll do your final adjustment once the chain is on. And for purposes of this video, I'm not going to go really into how to adjust a derailleur, but you want to go ahead and get the rear derailleur adjusted and then put the chain on. Chain is on, and I've adjusted my derailleur, and like I said before, I'm not running a front on this one, just a rear. And so you're adjusting your set screws and your cable tension. Now I'm going to put the bike on the ground and start adjusting things like saddle height. And just as a tip, I always measure my saddle heights, and I know exactly how high my saddles are supposed to be. And so when I put it on the ground, I can immediately just measure the saddle height. I'm going to straighten the stem, make sure everything's tightened here. Of course, make sure your top cap is tightened, so loosen your stem bolts, tighten the top cap, line everything up, and then tighten your stem bolts about a quarter turn each, going back and forth. And then make sure these stem bolts are tight, and you want to just go over the whole bike. Look at every single bolt that you have turned on this build and make sure everything is tight from front to back, top to bottom. Alright, I've got everything pretty much tightened up, everything adjusted. I put the grips on, and these ESI grips are really, really nice, and once they're on, but they are a bear to get on. You have to use rubbing alcohol, and I use an air compressor and put the nozzle in there, and even still, you got to really wrestle those things on. Your final step before you go ride is, if it's a mountain bike, you've got to adjust your suspension. And again, for this video, I'm not going to go into that, but you set your sag based on the air pressure. You've been riding for a while, you probably know what your rebound and suspension air pressure settings are. If not, then you have to just read up or find out how to set your suspension the way it's supposed to be. set up. Now, again, if you have a mountain bike and you've got brand new brakes, you want to go out and get up to about 15 miles an hour and then do a hard stop, come to a complete stop. That will seat in your brake pads. And one thing I didn't show, but what you probably want to do is take some rubbing alcohol on a rag or paper towel and wipe off your rotors, because you've handled those with your fingers and you don't want to leave any skin oil on your rotors before you use them. So do that, go out, seat in your brake pads, and then you can go ride. Let me close out this bike building video with a couple words. Bike building is very rewarding. It really enables you to utilize your mechanical skills and learn something new. Every time I build a bike, I learn something new. It can also be kind of frustrating at times. Sometimes things go really well, sometimes things don't go so well. So you have to use patience, and don't set a time limit on how long it's going to take you to build your bike. It always takes me longer than I think it's going to take. You just got to be patient. Don't try to do it all in one day or one night if you're kind of pressed for time. And again, use it as a good learning experience. And what's really nice about building a bike from the ground up is you know every single component, and if you're out traveling or at a race and you need to do some maintenance, you're probably already going to know how to do that because you built it for the ground up. So thanks for watching, and good luck with your build, and have fun riding.